Good morning. Welcome to the Bible study of the Gospel according to John. My name's Jake. Today we're starting chapter 7 of this Gospel. We finished chapter 6 last week. Hope everyone's had a good week and is excited about looking into chapter 7. Last week we looked at Jesus kind of telling all those folks following him why kind of giving them, revealing to them the real reason why they're following him because of the temporal, of the physical, materialistic needs, and not following him because he is worthy to be followed, because he is the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus disclosing to them that he is the bread of life, and teaching them from from a materialism point of view, from what's in this world, and having it as a metaphor to the spiritual teachings. And so anyway, we went through that, and ultimately the teaching was too hard for lots of, was hard for them to, a lot of these folks to accept, because they didn't want, Jesus for him, and to him to be Lord. It was mostly for what he can do for them, and in the now, in the temporal, materialistic way. And so, and then we get this famous statement from Peter. Jesus says, to his 12 disciples, are y'all going to go as well? And Peter says, Lord, where we're going to go? You alone have the words of life. And we talked about how, it's just such a remarkable statement by Peter. He has had good moments and bad moments, but it's something that I'm grateful for, that statement, and we had talked about how that applies to us. And so this week we're going to be reading chapter 7. And so it begins by saying, after this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. So after this is another time gap, about 6 months or so. And so lots of things happen in between. So John kind of skips forward in time with this statement. Now the Jews' Feast of Booths was at hand. So his brother said to him, leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you're doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. And then John inserts parenthetical statement, for not even his brothers believed in him. Jesus said to his brothers, my time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it, that its works are evil. You go up to the feast, I'm not going up to this feast, for my time is not yet fully come. After this, he remained in Galilee. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. The Jews were looking for him at the feast, saying, where is he? And there was much muttering about him among the people. While some said, he's a good man, others said, no, he's leading the people astray. Yet, for the fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, how is it that this man has learning when he has never studied? So Jesus answered them, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true. And in him there is no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keep the law. Why do you seek to kill me? The crowd answered, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? Jesus answered them, I did one work, and you all marveled at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but it's from the fathers. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's body well, whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. Some of the people of Jerusalem therefore said, is this not the man whom they seek to kill? And he is here, speaking openly, and they say nothing to him? Can it be that the authorities really know that this is the Christ? But we know where this man comes from. And when the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from. So Jesus proclaimed as he taught in the temple, you know me, and you know where I come from, but I have not come on my own accord. He who sent me is true, and him you do not know. I know him, for I come from him, and he sent me. So they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him, because his hour had not yet come. Yet many of the people believed in him. They said, when the Christ appears, will he do more signs than this man has done? The Pharisees heard the crowd muttering these things about him, and the chief priests and Pharisees sent officers to arrest him. Jesus then said, I will be with you a little longer, and then I am going to him who sent me. You will seek me, and you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come. The Jews said to one another, where does this man intend to go that we will not find him? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks? What does he mean by saying you will seek me and you will not find me, and where I am, you cannot come? On the last day of the feast, the great day, Jesus stood up and cried out, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scriptures has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. Now this he said about the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive. For as of yet, the Spirit had not been given because Jesus has not yet been glorified. When they heard these words, some of the people said, this really is the prophet. Others said, this is the Christ. But some said, is the Christ to come from Galilee? Has not the scripture said that the Christ comes from the offspring of David and comes from Bethlehem, the village where David was? So there was a division among the people over him. Some of them wanted to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him. The officers came to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, why did you not bring him in? The officers answered, no one ever spoke like this man. And the Pharisees answered them, have you also been deceived? Have any of the authorities or the Pharisees believed in him? But this crowd that does not know the law is accursed. Nicodemus, who had gone to him before, who was one of them, said to them, does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he says? And they replied, are you from Galilee too? Search and see, no prophet arises from Galilee. So we'll stop there. We read the entirety of chapter 7 because it's really just one flowing thought, one flowing event that's covered. And I didn't see that we could really break it up and we'll lose some of the continuity. So I kind of started to give you some insight as we read the scriptures, but we'll do as we do usual. We'll kind of read back through it and talk about context, talk about any references in the Old Testament, any historical things, and then lastly, we'll finish up with how this might be able to be applied to our lives. So going back from the top, we had already talked that there's some time passed, and Jesus was spending most of his time in North Israel, in the region of Galilee. We mentioned a couple of sessions back, after Jesus healing that paralytic man, that kind of marked the turning point of the ramped up persecution and aggression and towards Jesus from the Jewish Pharisees and Sadducees and the Jewish leaders. We also talked about division among some of the people following Jesus. And some of those believed, some of them thought he might be the prophet. So there's lots of discussion and talk, and he did have a lot of followers, and kind of went through some of that in the previous sessions. So with this, chapter 7 starts off saying that Jesus remained up in Galilee, and he didn't go down to Jerusalem or Judea, lower Judea, because the Jews were seeking to kill him. So Jesus was omnipotently well aware of the hearts of the Jewish leaders at this time, and wanted to stay and follow along the prophetic timeline of when, at the precise time that he would be crucified and offer himself up for mankind. And so, always being aware, as I've said before, of that prophetic timeline, he made decisions, and he followed those decisions accordingly. And so then it talks about his brothers. And so this is Jesus had half brothers. So Mary and Joseph, after the immaculate virgin birth of Jesus from Mary, Mary married Joseph, and they had actual children and had normal marital relations. So Jesus had half brothers and sisters, and the names of the brothers are mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, and so we know that James it was Jesus's brother, and he actually became a prominent leader in the Church of Jerusalem. And also Judas, or the letter Jude is in the New Testament, was one of his brothers. But at this time, and when Jesus was on the earth in his early life, his family, his brothers in particular, sisters, uh, John gives context that they didn't believe that he was the Messiah. Um, and there's a couple of reasons why you might think that. So sibling rivalry is a real thing, and that's possible. And maybe there's a mockery there by them telling Jesus, go up to Jerusalem and present yourself. You're doing all these things. You're saying you're big and bad. Go there, and it's time to show the world, and let's see how they respond. And so that's one thought. Another thought might be that um, they were given Jesus advice that any person who was publicly proclaiming to be the Messiah, or to be the one would need to go where the action is, would need to go to Jerusalem and announce themselves and publicly announce themselves. So it could be in that angle as well. But sibling rivalry kind of makes sense. I mean, if you think about it in some ways, because how if you were Jesus's brother growing up, and how perfect Jesus probably was, never did any wrong, was obedient to his parents, said all the right things, did all the right things, probably wasn't lazy, probably wasn't, he probably proactively did kind things to others, all those sorts of things that probably made them feel bad about themselves on a daily basis in some ways. And so maybe there was some jealousy because of that. But here it's recorded that they didn't believe at this time. And it also attests to the accuracy, or not necessarily the accuracy, but the authentication of the change. What would have caused James to change and Judas to change from unbelief to belief? But it's recorded in the New Testament that Jesus showed himself to James. After he resurrected from the dead. And that was that led to his conversion. And so again, something radical, something like that radically changed him, and he was willing to die for his faith and be martyred for his faith after that. So anyway, it says here they advised Jesus to go, and Jesus said, I'm not going. The world loves you, doesn't love me. And so what that just means is, when you're going along with the world systems, and you're not when Christians choose not to partake in things, or not to be involved in things because of their beliefs, a lot of times they'll get mocked for it, and a lot of times they'll get, especially if it's something that's real, that's real bad or something. And so, because it sheds light onto the sin that's being done there. And Jesus says as much. He says, the world doesn't hate you, but it hates me. And the reason why, he says, is because I testify that its works are evil. And so, again, everybody has a conscience, and we have to deal with that. And then, so some people, when they're convicted of their sin, turn to Christ, turn to God, and turn to receive forgiveness and receive mercy, and all of that. And some people, when they're convicted of sin, get angry and attack, and go on the attack. And so anyway, so Jesus says they don't receive me because I testify that its works are evil. But you go up to the feast. So this is the Feast of Tabernacles. This is one of the four feasts that any Jewish male or family would take a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to present themselves and to participate in these feasts. And so it would be the Feast of Lights, which is Hanukkah. It would be the Feast of the Booths, which is this particular feast, and it would be Passover. Feast of the Booths was a 7-day long feast that the Jews would celebrate in remembrance of God's provision and deliverance as they wandered through the wilderness toward the promised land, as they traveled toward the promised land. And God's provision was that he provided manna from heaven for them to eat in the desert, in the wilderness, and he provided water from a rock. In Deuteronomy, there's a passage where God, through Moses, telling Moses to strike or tap a rock to allow water to come forth so that people may drink. And so it just commemorates the provision of God's provision. And so it's 7 days, and so there's 2 Sabbaths that fall in there. They open it up with the celebration of the Sabbath, and then in the end, there's the final day is a kind of a culmination of the celebration and the feast, and they have this symbolic not ritual, I suppose, or symbolic activity that shows that symbolizes God's provision, providing water and providing light as in that night as a pillar of fire and things like that. So it was called the Feast of Lights, or not Feast of Lights, but it's called the Feast of Tabernacles or booths. And again, they would camp out; they'd be outside in these booths. And so it's like camping out all week. So it's a very fun holiday for the children, and they celebrate this particular holiday now, even to this day. And so then after this, Jesus goes ahead and goes up there secretly. So this would allow Jesus to blend in and to, not come into Jerusalem with a whole entourage of people. He was able to he planned on going. He did, so he just told them, I'm not coming with y'all. I'm not coming in this procession, but he did go. And so after his brothers and his family went up, and most likely his disciples as well. So then it goes and it says in verse 11, the Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, where is he? And after much mourning, you hear a bunch of discussion and muttering among the people. So his activity was the buzz. And there was discussion. Some people, there's division among the people. And the subject of Jesus divides people to this day, doesn't it? Even in families. If there's someone who believes in Jesus and is a follower of Jesus, there's that side, and there's folks that, of course, don't believe and even are offended by Jesus and what he stands for. And so you're seeing different discussions among the people at this feast, the Jewish people. And that it says in verse 13, yet for the fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. And so fear of the Jewish leadership is what that means. And so they were kicking people out of the synagogue for following Jesus. We had that occurrence where they wanted to do that. They were doing that in the Gospels, where if someone openly followed Jesus, they would cast them. And that's essentially casting them from Jewish society. If they were to cast them out of the synagogue, cast them out of participating in Judaism and all the things that go along with that. So it's a horrible thing to happen to them. And so they were afraid of the Pharisees and the Jews and the Jewish leaders. And then on the flip side, throughout this gospel, you'll see that the Jewish leaders are afraid of the people, afraid of an uprising, afraid of what they might do. And so there's definitely an underlying theme of fear, a fear of man, fear of another person, versus the fear of God Almighty, fear or respect or following the will of God Almighty. Yeah, about the middle of the feast, it says here, about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. So we're thinking, it sounds like it's probably the third or fourth day during that week, Jesus began teaching in the synagogue. And it notes that they're marveled because they think they know him, right? They know his background, they know where he's from, and they're just all in wonder of how deep his teachings are. Traditionally, Jewish males could read and write and knew some understanding of the scriptures because of their participation in the Jewish life and in Judaism. But to be able to teach lengthy, deep discourses and to be able to debate logically and all those things that the people of that time did is usually a sign of someone who spent years under the tutelage of a rabbi, or being officially learned and participating in those things. And so they know he didn't have that, and so they're marveled by the fact that he's a genius. and he's so has such authority with his teaching and his speaking. And then Jesus picks up on that and he says, and he goes into that discourse and the discussion about him. He's teaching what God tells him, what the Father tells him. His teaching is in his own. Um, he's not doing his own will. He's doing the Father's will, speaking to the unity that he has with the Father. He's reassuring them and talking about him being sent from the Father. And this is repeated things that he's said throughout this gospel. And again, it speaks to sort of that legalistic motif about the testimony of witnesses. One witness alone isn't accepted, but two or more are accepted. So it speaks to that. It also speaks to Jesus being in perfect unity of what God wants, what the Father wants and is doing. Him being a vessel or on a mission, from the Father, being obedient to the Father, even though he's God, he's our great example of obedience and following God's instruction and what he has called us to do. And so he speaks to that. And then he says, has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keep the law. Why do you seek to kill me? And so that kind of offends the audience. And they say, well, who's trying to offend you? You have a demon. That's basically the equivalent of them saying, you're crazy. Nobody's trying to kill you. And then Jesus gives a brilliant theological response to that. And it's the logical response of less to more or lesser to greater, which means, so he says, well, you're mad at me. Moses gave you the circumcision, which is really God's instruction to Moses, but Moses was the liaison between God and the people then. And so Jesus says, Moses gave you circumcision, and so that's harking back to the Mosaic law, where every newborn male needed to be circumcised on the eighth day. And so the eighth day is interesting because as a nurse, medical person, I know that newborn infants have issues with clotting, and they have to be given vitamin K on a birth. And so the eighth day is the day that's safest after birth for newborns to be able to have some sort of procedure. So that's interesting that God, it's not interesting, it's why, but it's interesting that, why not circumcise them on the first day? Well, because that would probably kill the baby. The baby would bleed to death. So by the eighth day, the baby has developed platelets and mechanisms to clot bleeding. So there's a little medical side note, but about circumcision. But Jesus is saying that circumcision, you perform circumcision no matter what on the eighth day, whether it falls on a Sabbath or not. And he says, and he's speaking to him here at this feast last year, healing the man who was paralyzed, what we read earlier in this gospel. And they got mad because he healed them on the Sabbath. He said, I healed a man, made him whole, and did a good thing on the Sabbath, and you're mad at me and you about that. And so it's the argument of lesser to greater. Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. And so this is the other side of the coin. So in Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he teaches, judge not lest you be judged by this, and judging. And he says, when you're judging, you're going to be judged by the same standard. And so there's a lot of people that kind of hijack that or take that out of context, especially Christians when we're talking to other Christians. Hey, man, don't judge, but it's really loving judgment. It's really judging. And Jesus says, but judge with right judgment. So don't just judge by appearances. And so don't judge a book by its cover. Don't judge without looking into it and seeing it all the angles. And so judgment is not necessarily a bad thing. It just needs to be rightly done. And of course, there's balance to that too. We shouldn't be just judging people and not knowing their circumstances and things like that. So it's good. It's just good practical application. But if you do judge someone, or if you do have to, give someone some consultation, or give someone some advice, or give someone counseling, come into it with right judgment. Look at all angles. Just because someone's covered with, tattoos and things like that doesn't mean that they haven't been cleansed by God. They haven't accepted Christ and are a new creation. And so You know, don't judge a book by its cover. Look at the whole thing. And then they go into this. John kind of talks about how the people have kind of talking about if this is Jesus, and they even say, "Is this not the man whom they seek to kill?" So there was a rumor that the Jewish leadership wanted to arrest Jesus and harm him, even though they replied earlier, "Oh, you must have a demon because nobody's trying to kill you." But it also talks about them knowing this rumor, um, and so that's why they were fearful by openly accepting him as Messiah as well, because they were worried about the Jewish leaders, how they would react. It talks about here in verse 27. We know where this man comes from. When the Christ appears, no one will know where he comes from. And so this is a belief, a tradition that was carried down by the rabbinic teachings and things that the teachings of the sages, because there's a passage in Isaiah that says, "Who can speak of the Messiah's generation?" And so that was misinterpreted as um, we're not going to know where it comes from. But there's also many, many scriptures that says exactly where he's coming from, and they actually reference these scriptures in the following passages about, isn't he supposed to be the line of David? Isn't he supposed to come from Bethlehem? So, but they had misinterpreted and thought that the Messiah would just appear out of nowhere, and they wouldn't really know him. And so that's a tradition, but it's not biblical. And then Jesus says, "Well, you do know me. You know me, and you know where I come from, but I have not come on." But he's speaking of his earth, this earth, right? You know that I'm the son of Mary and Joseph from Nazareth. But Jesus was in fact born in Bethlehem, as the Gospel Luke lays out. And both Mary and Joseph are descendants of David. And so again, they're judging and they're making decisions, but not having all the data, not having all the info. They're not investigating fully. It's just, kind of talking and hearsaying and things like that. And then Jesus continued to teach them, and it does say, yet many people believed in him. And they said, when the Christ, so they were acknowledging all the things that he was doing and his teachings and his authority, but still, teetering on belief. Then the Pharisees in verse 32 are listening to the crowd, and they're worried about the crowd, and they're worried about the crowd following after him and having an uprising and things like that. And so they dispatched officers to arrest Jesus. And when those officers went to do it, basically they were enamored by Jesus's teachings. And so the Pharisees weren't very happy about that. And then it says, Jesus said to them, "I will be with you a little longer, and then I'm going to him who sent me." So Jesus is speaking to his crucifixion and death and resurrection. "You'll seek me, but you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come." So Jesus is speaking spiritually to them, and they're not getting it. And they're thinking, what does he mean? He's going to go out of the country and go minister or speak to or be among the Jews in the dispersion. And so there's many Jewish settlements in the Roman Empire out throughout the world, known world. And so they're thinking that was known as the dispersion or the diaspora. And so they were thinking that he's saying he's going to them and getting out of the country. And so starting in verse 37, we're getting into the point where we're at the pinnacle of the feast. And so there was this ritual tradition where on the seventh day, everybody's feasting and gathered, and every day the Pharisees would pour water onto the altar, and it would flow from the altar out, and that was a symbolization of God providing water to the people of Israel. And they would also light these big oil vials throughout the city, and it would illuminate the city at night, and which was a picture of God pillar of fire leading the Jewish people at night, providing light at night. And on the last day, and so it says here, Jesus stood up and cried out. And so you could just kind of imagine, everybody's eating, and maybe either they're quiet because it's somber, or maybe they're murmuring and talking, and so Jesus loudly cries out. So he's saying, you can just see maybe a pin drops after that, and everybody turns and looks. And so this is the attempt to get everybody's attention, and we're talking thousands of people at this point, thousands upon thousands of people. And Jesus says, if anybody thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scriptures have said, out of his heart flow rivers of water. So it's just the Messiah is the Christ call out to people. You know, here we are gathered for a meal, and we're talking about how God provided water in the wilderness, and God provided food in the wilderness. And so this is Jesus saying, whoever believes in me will receive living water. And so this relates to the teachings and the discussions that he had with the woman at the well, and also what he had with the statement of "I am the bread of life" in the last chapter to the people. Jesus is relating the materialistic needs to the spiritual need. As we cannot live without water or bread, or without water or food, Jesus, we cannot. Our spirits, our souls cannot live without the everlasting well of life. And so there's a Roman, not Roman, there's an Old Testament passage that kind of alludes to that, and it's or talks about some of those things. Let me find it right. Isaiah 12:3. And you will draw water from the wells of salvation and joy. So water is often used as a metaphor for the Spirit and for salvation. And you will say on that day, give thanks to Yahweh, call on his name, make his deeds known among the peoples, bring to remembrance that his name is exalted. Sing praises to the Lord, Yahweh, for he has done a glorious thing, that is known in all the earth. So just a celebration there. And then Ezekiel also has an Old Testament reference of water coming from the temple. 47, I missed it. Let's see, 47. It's Ezekiel 47:1. And he brought me back to the doorway of the temple, and look, there was water coming out from under the threshold of the temple eastward, because the face of the temple was eastwards, and the water was coming down from under the south side of the temple, from south of the altar. And this is the temple. This is the vision of the temple in the future. So water and the Spirit are definitely water is definitely a metaphor for the Holy Spirit and for salvation. And then so John kind of gives a parenthetical statement here to clarify, because he's writing this after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, and the outpouring of the Holy Spirit on the day of Pentecost. And he's saying, now this he said about the Spirit, whom those who believed in him were to receive. And this is that's reference to the day of Pentecost in the book of Acts. For as of yet, the Spirit had not been given, because Jesus was not yet glorified. Jesus was glorified when he ascends to heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. So we go in the chapter, in the verses 40 forward, we're getting into the discussion among the people. Again, murmurings and people discussing and being afraid of others. And what about the Jewish leaders? What would they think? And so on. So they discuss, this is really the prophet. Others said, this is the Christ. And then others says, then they wonder about his origins again. When we know this guy's from Galilee, Galilee is out in the country. Does anything good come from there? The Messiah is supposed to come from Bethlehem, where David's from. And so again, Jesus fulfills all of those things. He was from Bethlehem. He was born in Bethlehem, and his lineage was of David on his mother and stepfather's side. And then in the end, it talks about when the officers came back to the chief Pharisees, priests and Pharisees, and they didn't have Jesus with them. And they're asking, why don't you? And they said, nobody ever spoke like this man. And so Jesus must have just been so captivating and just spoke with such authority and spoke things that feed our very soul, the things that we are longing to and need to hear. Especially these people at this time, for sure. And so they weren't compelled to arrest him. They're like, they probably felt like, why arrest this person? And so interesting. And then they say, well, we haven't believed, therefore they're the authority, right? They're the religious authority of the people, and that's what they think, And so, has any of us believed? In other words, implying that they had a wrong judgment by not arresting him. Then in the very end, it says Nicodemus speaks up. So Nicodemus, remember Nicodemus was the Pharisee that met with Jesus back in chapter 3 to inquire and to talk to Nicodemus, and he becomes a believer, kind of a hidden secret believer, because he was still among the Pharisees here. But you can see him trying to speak reason to them and saying, who had gone before, John reminds the audience that Nicodemus was the guy that met with Jesus. And then Nicodemus says, does our law judge a man without first giving him a hearing or learning what he does? And so he's recognizing that they're going A to Z. They're going straight to arresting him and killing him, and Nicodemus is saying, we have laws, right? And they say that, you need to be fair and to be appropriate. They need to have a hearing. And of course, they get angry with him and said, are you from Galilee too? As an insult, right? Because Galilee's out in the country. All the prominent, good, and important people are from Jerusalem. And he says, search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee. Well, they were wrong in that statement, because actually Jonah the prophet was from Galilee. So Nicodemus was shut down. So Nicodemus was talking about actual fair trials where you would bring them in, you'd have the actual witnesses and people speaking to testify of the doings of what's going on in the situation. So we knocked out a whole chapter at one sitting. So this has been helpful to everybody. And next week we're going to start up with the woman caught in adultery, which is a famous, very beautiful display of the grace of God. So as far as application before we close, there's a couple of things, that we see here. We see just division and disbelief versus belief, true followers and those that are not. And, and so that's something that we can, self-evaluate, and are we willing to be divided over him? Do we choose him no matter what? Why are we following him? You also see the fear of man playing a part in this, and so the Bible speaks to that. Fearing men means, wanting to please men, or being worried that a man or a woman might not like you because of doing something. So in Proverbs, it says, in Proverbs chapter 29, verse 25, it says, the fear of man lays a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord is safe. And so in the wisdom literature, it's laid out that you can get trapped in just being afraid of mankind, being afraid of your fellow man or woman, what they think of you, what they're going to say, whether they will accept you or reject you. And it can capture you. You can be enslaved to that. It can be a snare to you. And I know that in my own life. Everybody struggles with that. Everybody wants to be looked at in a positive light, or to be accepted, or to not be labeled weirdo or whatever. But the Bible teaches that that's a snare that can enslave you. You can be captivated and captured by that. But whoever trusts in the Lord is safe. And so it kind of goes back to what Peter said. Where else we're going to go? You have the words of eternal life. And so when I'm worried about a bunch of different things, or if I'm in a situation where I'm worried if I'll offend someone, of course I want to do things in a loving way, and in a way that's with wisdom. But ultimately, I want, you're free when you follow the road of just doing what pleases God. You're free from the worry of what people think about you. You're free from making poor choices to the point of from over one person versus another. If you live to please God, or you live with Him as your north, as you're facing when you're living out your life, then you really don't have anything else to worry about, because God will take care of you, and God loves you, and shows favor on you. Well, that's going to wrap it up this week. Hope everyone has a wonderful week. Thanks so much, and God bless y'all.